She was sentenced to burn at sunrise until the territory's deadliest Apache claimed her as his wife. That woman had allegedly murdered 3 children in their beds, someone whispered, poisoned the preacher's well, and tried to flee into the Badlands under cover of darkness. She'd be nothing but ash before the morning sun cleared the mesa. But what rode down from those red canyon walls would change everything the people of Bitter Springs thought they knew about justice, mercy, and the savage heart that beats in every man's chest. The desert town of Bitter Springs crouched against the base of crimson cliffs like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Adobe buildings baked white in the relentless sun, their flat roofs dotted with wooden crosses that cast short shadows in the September heat.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Dust devils danced between the structures, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that tasted of fear and blood when the wind shifted just right. This was a place where civilization hung by threads thin as spider silk, where the difference between law and vengeance was measured in the temper of whoever wore the badge that week. The Apache raids had been getting worse, bolder, closer to town with each passing month. Families barricaded themselves behind shuttered windows when the sun went down, and children were taught to sleep with one ear always listening for the sound of unshod hooves on hardpan earth. Into this powder keg of terror and suspicion had walked Isabella Santos, a woman whose very presence seemed to court disaster. She'd arrived 3 weeks ago on the weekly supply wagon, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and eyes the color of storm clouds over the Sangre Cristo Mountains. The wagon driver said she'd paid her fare in silver coins so old they bore the mark of Spanish kings, and that she'd spoken barely a word during the 2-day journey from Tucson. Isabella was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, like lightning or wildfire, or the edge of a cliff that promises either flight or falling. Her skin held the warm olive tone of Mexican heritage, but her features carried something else, something that made the town's women whisper behind their hands and the men stare when they thought their wives weren't watching. Her black hair fell in waves to her waist, often braided with small silver ornaments that caught the light when she moved. She was perhaps 25 years old, though her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen far more of the world's cruelty than her years should have allowed. She'd taken a room above the mercantile store, paying 2 months' rent in advance, with more of those ancient coins. Samuel Morrison, the store's owner, had been happy enough to take her money. Silver was silver, after all, and business had been slow since the Apache troubles began. But happiness turned to unease when strange things started happening around Isabella Santos. It began with the children. Little Tommy Brennan, barely 5 years old, had been playing in the street when he'd fallen and scraped his knee bloody. Isabella had appeared as if from nowhere, kneeling beside the boy with a small leather pouch in her hands. She'd sprinkled something over the wound herbs, most likely, though they smelled like nothing anyone in Bitter Springs had ever encountered. The bleeding stopped immediately, and by the next morning, there wasn't even a scar. Margaret Cleary's baby had been burning with fever, the kind that took children in the territory more often than their mothers could bear to count. Isabella had come to their door uninvited, carrying a clay pot that steamed with aromatic vapors. She'd sat with the child through the night, humming songs in a language that sounded like wind through canyon stones. By dawn, the fever had broken, and little Patrick Cleary was sitting up and asking for milk. Word of these healings spread through Bitter Springs like smoke from a signal fire. Some called it a blessing. God had sent them an angel disguised as a Mexican woman. Others whispered darker possibilities. Reverend Ezra Holbrook had been particularly vocal in his suspicions, reminding his congregation from the pulpit that the devil often appeared in pleasing forms, offering gifts that came with prices too terrible to imagine. The Reverend's warnings might have remained just words if not for what happened to the Warren family. Jacob Warren was a decent man, a blacksmith who'd come to Bitter Springs with his wife Mary and their 3 children after Apache raids had burned out their homestead near Tombstone. They'd lost everything except their lives, and Jacob had worked 16-hour days at his forge to rebuild what the raiders had taken. Mary had been grateful for Isabella's help when their youngest, little Sarah, had come down with the same fever that had nearly claimed the Cleary baby. Isabella had come as before, uninvited but not unwelcome, carrying her mysterious remedies and ancient songs. She'd sat with Sarah through another long night, and once again, the fever had broken with the sunrise. But this time, something else had broken too. 3 days later, all 3 Warren children were found dead in their beds. There had been no signs of violence, no indication of struggle or poisoning. They had simply gone to sleep and never awakened, their faces peaceful as carved marble, their bodies cold as winter stone. Dr. Henry Fleming, the town's only physician, could find no cause of death. Their hearts had simply stopped beating, he reported, as if something had reached into their chests and stilled the vital spark that kept them alive. The timing was impossible to ignore. Mary Warren's screams when she discovered her children had awakened half the town, and her accusations had spread faster than prairie fire. The Mexican woman was a witch, she sobbed, a bruja who healed some children only to steal the life force of others. Isabella Santos had murdered her babies with dark magic, and justice demanded blood for blood. Sheriff William Garrett was a practical man who'd seen enough frontier violence to know that witch hunts were just another form of mob rule. But he was also a man who understood that sometimes maintaining order meant giving the people what they needed to feel safe, even if justice got trampled in the process. The evidence against Isabella was circumstantial at best, suspicious timing, and the hysterical accusations of a grieving mother. But evidence had never been the point. Bitter Springs needed someone to blame for the string of bad luck that had plagued them all summer. The failed harvest, the contaminated well that had sickened half the town, the Apache raids that came closer each week. All of it could be laid at the feet of one woman who'd appeared from nowhere carrying silver coins and secrets. It was easier than admitting they were simply vulnerable, simply human, simply afraid. Isabella had offered no defense when they came for her. She'd submitted to the shackles with the same quiet dignity she'd shown when healing their children, speaking only once to ask if she might keep the small leather pouch that contained her herbs. The request was denied. The trial, such as it was, lasted less than an hour. Judge Cornelius Fairfax had ridden down from the territorial capital, more interested in returning to his comfortable bed than in examining evidence too closely. 3 witnesses testified to Isabella's presence at the Warren house. Reverend Holbrook spoke passionately about the dangers of tolerating witchcraft in a Christian community. Mary Warren sobbed through her accusations, and no one had the heart to question a mother's grief too closely. Isabella was given one chance to speak in her own defense. She stood in the makeshift courtroom, the saloon cleared of its usual patrons, and said simply, "I have harmed no one. What I did from love." Judge Fairfax pronounced her guilty of murder by supernatural means and sentenced her to death by burning, the traditional punishment for witchcraft. The execution would take place at sunrise, when the whole town could witness justice being done. They built the pyre in the center of town, stacking dry mesquite and cedar around a post driven deep into the hard-packed earth. The wood had been soaked with coal oil to ensure it would burn hot and fast. A mercy, some said, though mercy seemed a strange word to use for deliberately setting another human being on fire. As the sun set behind the western mesas, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Isabella Santa sat in the jail's single cell and waited for dawn. She did not weep, did not rage against her fate, did not call upon God or devil for deliverance.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Instead, She hummed the same ancient song she'd sung over sick children, her voice carrying through the jail's thick adobe walls to drift on the evening air like a prayer or a lament. The night was long and full of sounds that made the townspeople bar their doors and shutter their windows. Coyotes howled from the surrounding hills, their voices raised in harmonies that seemed almost human. An owl called from the mission bell tower, its cry echoing off the canyon walls in patterns that suggested meaning beyond animal communication. Most unsettling of all was the wind, which picked up after midnight and carried with it the scent of rain that never fell, and the whisper of voices speaking in languages that predated the Spanish conquest by 1,000 years. Sheriff Garrett made his rounds as always, checking locks and looking for signs of trouble. But tonight felt different, charged with the kind of electric tension that preceded thunderstorms in the high desert. He found himself glancing often toward the eastern horizon, as if expecting to see something approaching through the darkness, though what that something might be, he couldn't have said. In her cell, Isabella continued her quiet singing, her voice never wavering despite the fate that awaited her with the sunrise. The ancient melody seemed to weave through the desert night like threads in some vast tapestry, connecting her to powers and purposes that the people of Bitter Springs couldn't begin to understand. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that Isabella's songs were not laments but summons, not prayers but battle cries sung in the old tongue of her grandmother's people. She was not Mexican at all, despite her name and appearance. She was Chiricahua Apache, adopted as a child by Spanish missionaries after her family was killed in a cavalry raid, raised in their traditions but never forgetting the blood that flowed in her veins, and in the mountains above Bitter Springs. That song was being heard and understood by one who had been searching for her for longer than the white man's law had existed in this territory. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first promise of dawn, the people of Bitter Springs gathered around the pyre. Men, women, and children came to witness what they believed would be the end of their troubles, the cleansing fire that would burn away the curse that had fallen upon their town. Reverend Holbrook stood ready with his Bible, prepared to offer last rites to a woman he was convinced had sold her soul to darkness. Isabella was led from the jail in chains, her hands bound behind her back, her feet bare against the rough ground. She wore the same simple brown dress she'd been arrested in, now stained with 3 days of confinement, but still carrying herself with that untouchable dignity that had marked her from the beginning. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her storm cloud eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, where the sun was beginning to climb above the mesa tops. They tied her to the post with rough hemp rope, the same kind used for hanging cattle thieves and claim jumpers. The wood was stacked around her feet, and Sheriff Garrett held the torch that would light her funeral pyre. The gathered crowd was silent now, the reality of what they were about to do settling over them like a shroud. "Any last words?" Judge Fairfax asked, more from legal tradition than any expectation of revelation. Isabella raised her eyes to the lightening sky and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the silent square. "The blood of the innocent cries out for justice, and it will be answered." Then she began to sing again, her voice rising pure and strong above the desert morning. The song was different now, no longer the healing lullaby she'd hummed through the night. This was something older, wilder, a call that seemed to make the very stones of the earth vibrate with power. Reverend Holbrook stepped forward with his Bible. "Do you renounce Satan and all his works? Do you ask God's forgiveness for your sins?" Isabella's only answer was to sing louder, her voice carrying across the desert with the force of wind through canyon stones. Judge Fairfax nodded to Sheriff Garrett. "Light it." The torch touched the oil-soaked wood, and flames leaped upward with hungry eagerness. The fire caught and spread, crackling and roaring as it consumed the dry fuel. Smoke began to rise, black and thick, carrying with it the scent of burning cedar and something else, something that reminded the watchers uncomfortably of flowers and rain and growing things. But before the flames could reach the woman tied to the post, before the fire could claim its intended victim, the thunder of hooves shattered the morning silence. Like a gunshot through glass dot from the eastern canyon came a sight that froze the blood in every vein and turned the gathered crowd to statues of terror and disbelief. Down the narrow trail that led from the high mesas rode a figure from their darkest nightmares, an Apache warrior mounted on a painted war pony, his face streaked with the red and black pigments of the warpath. Nalnish was a name spoken in whispers throughout the Arizona territory, a legend made flesh that had haunted the white settlements for more than a decade. He was said to be 8 feet tall, capable of appearing and disappearing like smoke, able to kill a dozen men before any one of them could draw his gun. His raids had left countless homesteads burned and empty, countless graves scattered across the desert floor, but the reality of him was both more and less than the legend suggested. He was not 8 feet tall, but rather just above average height, his body lean and hard as desert iron from years of warfare and survival. His face was angular and sharp-featured, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a reminder of a cavalry saber that had come too close during a raid on Fort Bowie. His black hair hung loose to his shoulders, decorated with eagle feathers and small bones that clicked softly when he moved. He wore traditional Apache clothing, breechcloth, and high-top moccasins, a shirt of soft deerskin decorated with beadwork that told the story of his deeds in battle. Around his waist was a wide belt that held a knife with a blade as long as a man's forearm, and across his back was strung a bow made from the horn of a mountain sheep, with a quiver full of arrows whose points gleamed like stars in the morning light. But it was his eyes that marked him as something beyond ordinary human experience. They were black as midnight water, deep as canyon shadows, and they held within them the kind of intelligence that missed nothing and forgot even less. These were the eyes of a predator, a killer, a man who had taken more lives than most people had years. He rode straight into the town square, with no regard for the rifles that swung to track his movement, the pistols that cleared leather in desperate haste. His war pony, a pinto mare with markings that seemed to shift and flow in the morning, light stepped delicately around the burning pyre, her nostrils flaring at the scent of smoke, but showing no fear of the flames or the crowd of white faces that surrounded them. Nalnish's voice, when he spoke, was like wind through dry leaves, carrying easily across the square despite its quiet tone. He spoke in English, though his accent turned the familiar words into something foreign and dangerous. "This woman is my wife," he said, his black gaze fixing on Isabella's face with an intensity that made the very air seem to burn. "You will release her now." The crowd stood frozen in disbelief and terror. This was impossible, beyond comprehension. Apache warriors didn't ride into white settlements in broad daylight. They didn't claim white women as wives. They didn't speak English with the calm authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sheriff Garrett was the first to find his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. You're Nalnish." The Apache warrior's scarred face showed the ghost of a smile. "I am, and you are burning my wife." "She's a murderer," Judge Fairfax managed to say, his voice shaking despite his attempts at authority. "Convicted in a court of law." "Your law," Nalnish replied with contempt. "Not mine, not hers." He looked again at Isabella, who had stopped singing and was watching him with those storm cloud eyes. "Are you hurt, Desba?" The Apache name rolled off his tongue like music, and Isabella Desba shook her head slightly. The flames were growing higher around her, licking at the hem of her dress, but she showed no fear. "Then we go," Nalnish said simply. He swung down from his horse with fluid grace, landing silent as a cat despite his height and the weapons he carried. Every gun in the square was trained on him now, but he moved as if he were alone in the desert, unhurried and utterly confident. The sheriff raised his rifle. You take one more step and we'll cut you down where you stand." Nalnish paused, his hand resting on the hilt of his long knife. When he smiled, it was the expression a wolf might wear when cornering wounded prey. "You can try," he said. What happened next would be spoken of in hushed whispers around campfires for generations to come. Nalnish moved like liquid shadow, his knife singing from its sheath in one fluid motion, as Sheriff Garrett's finger tightened on his rifle trigger. But the Apache warrior had fought the white man's soldiers for 15 years, and he knew their weapons, their reflexes, their fatal hesitation in the face of true violence. The blade left his hand as if it had wings of its own, spinning end over end through the smoke-filled air. It took Garrett in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering to the ground. Before the sheriff had even hit the dirt, Nalnish was moving again, a blur of lethal grace that defied the eye to follow. Deputy Marcus Webb tried to bring his shotgun to bear, but found himself staring down the shaft of an Apache arrow that had appeared in Nalnish's bow as if by magic. The arrowhead, gleaming with a substance that looked suspiciously like poison, was aimed directly at Webb's heart. "Drop your weapons," Nalnish commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had never given an order he wasn't prepared to enforce with blood. All of them, now. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 30 armed townspeople facing one Apache warrior who should have been impossibly outnumbered. But there was something in Nalnish's presence that transformed the equation. A predatory confidence that spoke of battles fought and won against odds far worse than these. Judge Fairfax, his face pale as parchment, tried to maintain some semblance of legal authority. "This is a court of law, Savage. You have no jurisdiction here." Nalnish's scarred face split in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Your courts burned my people's children. Your law murdered my wife's family. Your jurisdiction ends where my arrow finds your heart." He drew the bowstring back another inch, the poisoned point never wavering from Webb's chest. "Drop your weapons." The deputy was the first to break, his shotgun falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the hard-packed earth. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held the crowd frozen, and other weapons began dropping as well, rifles, pistols, even the hunting knives that some of the men carried. But not everyone was convinced by Nalnish's threats. Coleman Pierce, the town's biggest rancher and a man who'd lost 2 of his best hands to Apache raids, stepped forward with his Colt .45 still firmly in his grip. "I don't care if you're Nalnish or the devil himself," Pierce snarled, his weathered face twisted with years of accumulated hatred. "You murdered my boys, burned my ranch. This ends here." The rancher's gun came up fast, faster than most men could have reacted to. But Nalnish was not most men. His arrow released with a sound like silk tearing, and Pierce's scream cut through the morning air as the shaft took him through the gun hand, pinning it to his chest. The Colt fell unfired, and Pierce collapsed to his knees, staring in shock at the feathered shaft that protruded from his body. "I remember your ranch," Nalnish said conversationally, already knocking another arrow. "Your men killed Apache children for sport. Called it pest control." His eyes were black fire as he looked down at the wounded rancher. "This is what justice looks like when it has claws." The message was clear to everyone present. This was not a man who could be intimidated, outfought, or reasoned with using white man's logic. This was Shizia, Apache for killer, and he had earned that name in blood across a dozen territories. While the crowd stood paralyzed by fear and indecision, the flames around Isabella had grown higher, licking at her skirts and filling the air with the acrid smell of burning cloth. The rope that bound her to the post was beginning to smolder, and her face was flushed with heat that would soon become unbearable. Nalnish saw this and made a decision that would haunt the dreams of everyone present. He whistled once, a sharp note that sounded like a hawk's cry, and his war pony stepped forward without guidance. In one fluid motion, he vaulted onto her back, bow still ready, and rode straight into the flames. The Pinto Mar never hesitated, her hooves striking sparks from the burning wood as she carried her rider through the fire itself. Nalnish leaned down, his knife slicing through Isabella's bonds as if they were made of spider silk. Then his arm was around her waist, lifting her onto the horse behind him, and they were through the fire and out the other side. Before the stunned crowd could even comprehend what they'd witnessed, Isabella's dress was singed but not seriously burned, her hair smelling of smoke but her skin unmarked by the flames. She wrapped her arms around Nalnish's waist, pressing her face against his shoulder, and for the first time since her arrest, she spoke. "Ahihi shikis," she whispered in the Apache tongue. "Thank you, my husband." Nalnish's response was to spur his horse toward the edge of town, but their escape was far from assured. The shock that had held the crowd frozen was beginning to wear off, and angry voices were rising from the assembled townspeople. "Don't let them get away," Reverend Holbrook shouted, his Bible forgotten as he pointed toward the fleeing pair. "She's a murderer, he's a savage. They'll bring the whole Apache nation down on us." The Reverend's words sparked the crowd into action. Men scrambled for their dropped weapons while others ran for their horses. Within minutes, a pursuit party was forming, led by Captain James Morrison, Samuel's brother and a former cavalry officer who'd fought Apaches from the Chiricahua Mountains to the Mexican border. Morrison was a hard man made harder by years of frontier warfare. He'd seen entire families butchered by Apache raiders, whole settlements wiped from the map as if they'd never existed. In his mind, there was no such thing as a good Apache, only dead ones and ones that hadn't been caught yet. "Mount up," Morrison bellowed, swinging into the saddle of his big cavalry horse. "We'll run them down before they reach the canyon country." But Nalnish had no intention of running. As the pursuit party formed behind him, he guided his horse not toward the safety of the high mesas, but toward a small rise that overlooked the town. There, silhouetted against the morning sky, he stopped and turned to face his pursuers. Isabella could feel the tension in his body, the coiled readiness of a warrior preparing for battle. "There are too many," she whispered in Apache. "We should run. Running is for rabbits," Nalnish replied in the same language. "We are Inda, the people. We do not run from those who burn children." He reached behind him and pulled a war lance from where it had been secured to his saddle, a weapon nearly 8 feet long, its steel point gleaming like captured lightning. Turkey feathers and enemy scalps decorated the shaft, trophies from a dozen battles against the white man's army. The pursuit party had swollen to nearly 40 men, all mounted and armed for war. They spread out in a rough line as they approached the rise, confident in their numbers and firepower. Morrison rode at their head, his cavalry saber glinting in the sunlight. "Surrender, Nalnish," the captain called out when they were within shouting distance. "You're outnumbered 40 to 1. Even you can't fight those odds." The Apache warrior's response was to raise his lance above his head and give a war cry that seemed to shake the very stones of the earth. It was a sound from before the white man came, before crosses marked the graves of Apache children, before the long trail of broken treaties and burned villages that stretched back to the beginning of the Indian Wars. Then he charged. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a masterwork of violence, painted in blood and terror across the desert morning. Nalnish's war pony flew down the slope like a creature born of storm and lightning, her hooves barely seeming to touch the ground as she carried her rider into the heart of the enemy formation. The Apache warrior's lance took the first rider clean through the chest, lifting him from his saddle and hurling him backward into his companions. Before the man had even hit the ground, Nalnish had wheeled his horse and drawn his bow, sending arrow after arrow into the confused mass of horsemen with accuracy that seemed supernatural. Morrison tried to rally his men, but they were fighting an enemy that moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Every time they thought they had Nalnish cornered, He would vanish only to appear behind them, his weapons finding their marks with deadly precision. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith's son, took an arrow through the throat and toppled from his horse without a sound. Pete Williams, who ran the general store, screamed as Nalnish's knife opened him from collarbone to belt buckle. Frank Morrison, the captain's own nephew, died when the Apache warrior's tomahawk split his skull like a ripe melon through it all. Isabella watched from the hilltop where Nalnish had left her, her storm-gray eyes taking in every detail of the slaughter below. She felt no horror at the violence, no pity for the men who were dying. These were the same people who would have burned her alive for the crime of healing their children, who had called her a witch and a murderer based on nothing more than fear and superstition. But she also understood that this battle, spectacular as it was, could not continue indefinitely. Even Nalnish's superhuman skill had limits, and more men were arriving from town every minute. Soon the pursuers would number in the hundreds, and not even the legendary Apache war chief could stand against such odds. As if reading her thoughts, Nalnish appeared beside her again, his horse lathered with sweat, and his weapons painted red with enemy blood. Behind him, the remnants of the pursuit party were regrouping, their numbers reduced by more than half, but their determination, if anything, stronger than before. "We go now," he said simply, helping her back onto his horse. They rode hard for the canyon country, but this time they were not alone. From the high rocks came answering war cries, and Isabella saw other mounted figures materializing from the landscape itself. Apache warriors, dozens of them, riding to join their war chief in his moment of need. She recognized some of them from the stories her grandmother had told. Goyakla, the one the whites called Geronimo, Jew, whose very name meant mountain in the Apache tongue. Nate, son of the great Cochise himself. These were the legendary fighters who had held off the entire United States Army for more than a generation. Men whose names were spoken with fear from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. As the Apache war party swept down from the mountains, the remaining townspeople of Bitter Springs finally understood the magnitude of what they had attempted. They had not just been fighting one man. They had been fighting the gathered might of the Chiricahua Nation, and that was a battle no frontier town could hope to win. The retreat back to Bitter Springs was a rout, the surviving men whipping their horses to dangerous speeds in their desperate flight from the vengeful spirits that seemed to rise from every rock and ravine. Behind them came the sound of Apache war cries, a haunting chorus that promised death to any who tried to follow. Nalnish did not pursue them. Instead, he guided his horse to a hidden spring deep in a canyon that the white man's maps had never recorded, where ancient petroglyphs marked the presence of his people stretching back to the time when the world was young. There, as his warriors made camp and tended their weapons, he finally had a chance to speak privately with the woman he had claimed as his wife. Isabella, Desba, sat beside the spring's clear water, washing the smoke and soot from her face and hands while he watched her with those midnight black eyes. "You came for me," she said finally, her voice soft as wind through pine needles. "I gave my word," Nalnish replied. "Apache words are not broken like white man's treaties." "When?" she asked. "When did you give this word?" Nalnish was quiet for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable in the flickering light of the campfires. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older promises. "When we were children," he said. "Before the soldiers came. Before your family was taken. Before you were given to the Spanish priests and taught to forget who you were." He reached out and touched her face with surprising gentleness. "I promised your father I would find you. I promised I would bring you home." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow, bringing back memories she had tried for years to bury. She was 8 years old again, hiding in a cave while cavalry soldiers burned her village and killed everyone she had ever loved. She remembered her father's last words, whispered as he pushed her deeper into the darkness. "Nalnish will come. For you, Wait for Nalnish. 20 years she had waited, growing up in Spanish missions and Mexican towns, learning the white man's ways while the Apache blood in her veins called out for the high desert and the songs of her people. 20 years of healing the sick and helping the wounded, trying to atone for a massacre she had been powerless to prevent. And now he had come, just as her father had promised. The greatest warrior of the Apache nation had ridden into the teeth of an armed mob to honor a pledge made to a dying man in a burning village 2 decades past. "I remember," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I remember everything." Nalnish gathered her into his arms, and for the first time since that terrible night when her world had ended in fire and blood, Isabella felt truly safe. She was home at last, among her own people, in the arms of the man who had never forgotten his promise to a little girl's dying father. But their reunion was far from the end of the story. Even now, riders were galloping toward the territorial capital, carrying word of the morning's events to the authorities. The United States Army would be marching within days, and this time they would come not just for Nalnish, but for his entire band. The Apache Wars were about to enter their bloodiest phase, and at the center of it all would be a woman who had been condemned to burn and the warrior who had claimed her as his wife. The desert would run red with blood before their story reached its end, and the very fate of the Apache nation would hang in the balance. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the mountains, though no clouds marked the evening sky. It was the sound of cavalry horses, hundreds of them, moving toward a confrontation that would echo through history like the war. Cries of ghosts. 3 days after the battle at Bitter Springs, the sacred canyon known to the Apache as Sisui, the place where water emerges from rock, witnessed a ceremony that no white man had ever seen and lived to tell about. The ancient walls, carved by wind and water over countless generations, held secrets older than the Spanish conquest, older than the memory of any living tribe. Isabella stood at the edge of the sacred pool, her body painted with traditional designs in red ochre and white clay. The symbols told the story of her lineage, the lightning bolt that marked her as a daughter of storm clouds, the mountain lion tracks that honored her grandmother's clan, the sacred pollen marks that blessed her with fertility and long life. She wore a dress of the finest deerskin, decorated with turquoise beads and silver ornaments that caught the morning light like captured stars. The dress had belonged to Ishtan, Nalnish's mother, who had died during the massacre at Apache Pass 15 years before. It was a garment that had seen the marriage of chiefs, the blessing of warriors, the birth of children who would grow up to lead their people in war and peace. Now it wrapped around Isabella like the embrace of generations, connecting her to a heritage she had been forced to abandon but never truly forgotten. Uasessen, the creator, was invoked through the ancient songs that echoed from the canyon walls. The Apache medicine man, Nake Detklin, whose very name meant the one who controls the seasons, had traveled 3 days through hostile territory to perform this ceremony. He was ancient beyond counting, his face carved by time into lines that resembled the petroglyphs covering the sacred stones. The old shaman moved with a reverence that spoke of powers beyond human understanding, sprinkling sacred pollen in the 4 directions, while chanting words that had been old when the Spanish first set foot in this land. The smoke from his sacred fire carried prayers to the spirits of the mountains, the rivers, the desert itself, all bearing witness to the union about to take place. Nalnish approached the sacred circle wearing the full regalia of an Apache war chief. His chest was painted with the symbols of his exploits, each mark representing a battle won, an enemy defeated, a village saved from destruction. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and around his neck hung a medicine bag containing the sacred objects that had protected him through countless fights. But it was not just his appearance that marked this as extraordinary. Every Apache warrior from 3 tribes had gathered for this ceremony: Chiricahua, Mescalero, and Jicarilla, putting aside old rivalries to witness the marriage of their greatest war leader. Men who had fought each other over hunting grounds and water rights now stood side by side, united by their respect for Nalnish and their understanding of what this union represented. Among them stood warriors, whose names were legend. Victorio, whose raids had terrorized the Mexican border for a generation. Mangus Colorado, son of the great chief who had been murdered under a flag of truce. Loco, whose tactical genius had frustrated army generals from Fort Apache to Fort Bowie. These were men who bowed to no white authority, who recognized no law but that of their ancestors, and they had all come to honor this marriage. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the Christian missions had taught Isabella to expect. There were no vows spoken in English, no promises of obedience or submission. Instead, the couple drank from the same spring, their hands bound together with rawhide, blessed by the medicine man, their foreheads touched with sacred pollen that connected them to the eternal cycle of seasons. I-det-kline spoke the ancient words that made them one people, one spirit, one heart beating in two bodies. He called upon the spirits of their ancestors to bless this union, to grant them strength in war and wisdom in peace, to make their children strong and their love eternal as the mountains themselves. Hashki Nalnish, ta also Aohute, the old shaman intoned. The warrior and the healer, together they are complete. As the ceremony reached its climax, Isabella felt something stirring within her that had nothing to do with the marriage ritual. It was a power she had always possessed but never understood, a connection to forces that the Spanish priests had tried to beat out of her during her years in their missions. Now surrounded by her people and joined to their greatest champion, that power awakened like a sleeping dragon. The sacred spring began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun overhead. The water rose from its ancient bed without wind or earthquake, forming patterns in the air that spoke of prophecy and power. Every warrior present fell silent, recognizing the presence of something beyond the physical world. Isabella, Desba, raised her hands, and the floating water responded to her gesture, shaping itself into images that told the story of things to come. The assembled warriors saw armies marching, battles raging, the very future of their people hanging in the balance. But they also saw victory, saw their children growing strong in the old ways, saw a time when the Apache nation would endure long after the white man's civilization had crumbled to dust. Diante, whispered one of the younger warriors. She is blessed by the spirits. Nalnish watched his new wife with something approaching awe. He had known she possessed the healing gift, had seen her cure sickness and mend broken bones with her touch. But this was something far greater. This was the power of prophecy, the ability to see beyond the veil that separated the world of men from the realm of spirits. When the vision faded and the sacred water returned to its pool, the assembled warriors knew they had witnessed something that would be spoken of for generations. This was not just a marriage between two people. It was a union blessed by the Creator himself, a joining that would determine the fate of all Apache people. But even as the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, riders were approaching through the canyon country. Colonel Marcus Whitman of the 8th Cavalry Regiment was leading the largest force ever assembled against the Apache. 1,200 soldiers, Pima and Navajo scouts, artillery pieces that could reduce a mountain stronghold to rubble. The colonel was a veteran of the Civil War, a man who had broken Confederate armies and now turned his considerable skills to what he called the Apache problem. Whitman was not like the frontier officers who had fought the Apache before. He understood that this was not just a military campaign but a war of extinction, one that would end either with the complete subjugation of the Apache nation or with white civilization driven from the southwest entirely. There could be no middle ground, no negotiated peace, no coexistence between two peoples who viewed the world through fundamentally different eyes. The colonel had studied every battle Nalnish had ever fought, analyzing the tactics that had made him virtually unbeatable in the field. He understood that conventional military strategy was useless against an enemy who could appear and disappear like smoke, who knew every canyon and mesa in a territory larger than most eastern states. So Whitman had devised a different approach, one that would draw Nalnish into a battle on the white man's terms, in a place where superior numbers and firepower could not be negated by Apache mobility and knowledge of the terrain. The bait was carefully chosen. A wagon train carrying supplies to the mining camps near Tucson would travel the well-known route through Dragoon Pass, a narrow defile between towering rock walls that had been the site of Apache ambushes for generations. The wagons would be lightly guarded, apparently easy prey for raiders looking to capture rifles, ammunition, and the other supplies that kept Apache war parties in the field. But hidden in the rocks on both sides of the pass would be 800 soldiers with rifles, mountain howitzers that could rain explosive death into the canyon floor, and Gatling guns that could fire 600 rounds per minute. When Nalnish and his warriors rode into the trap, they would find themselves caught in a crossfire that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. What Whitman didn't know was that his plans had already been discovered. Among the Pima scouts he relied on was Jesse Chi, a man whose Apache grandmother had taught him that loyalty to one's blood was stronger than any white man's gold. She had listened to the colonel's briefings, memorized every detail of the planned ambush, and found a way to get word to the Apache camps. The message reached Nalnish on the morning after his wedding, carried by a raven that spoke with human words, one of the spirit animals that seemed to gather around his new wife like moths around a flame. The bird perched on his shoulder and whispered the details of Whitman's trap in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "They think to cage the storm," Nalnish said after hearing the raven's report. "They will learn that lightning cannot be trapped." But Desba saw deeper into the situation than her husband's warrior instincts allowed. The power that had awakened during their wedding ceremony showed her visions of what would happen if they met Whitman's army in direct battle. Thousands of Apache dead, their children enslaved, their way of life extinguished forever. "There is another way," she told him as they sat by their fire that night. "The spirits have shown me a path that leads not to destruction but to something greater." She had seen it in the sacred waters, a vision of power that could reshape the very nature of the conflict between Apache and white man. Not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through forces that existed beyond the physical world, the ancient magic of her people, awakened and focused through the union of warrior and healer. "What do you propose?" Nalnish asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We go to Dragoon Pass," Desba replied, "but not to fight their battle. We go to fight ours." The preparation took 2 days and involved rituals that had not been performed for generations. Desba worked with the medicine men, gathering herbs that grew only in sacred places, preparing powders and potions that would amplify the natural powers of every warrior. She painted symbols on their horses that would make them swift as the wind, blessed their weapons with prayers that would guide every arrow to its target. Most importantly, she prepared herself for what was to come. The vision had shown her the price of victory. It would require her to channel powers that might consume her in the process, to open herself to forces that could destroy her as easily as they would destroy her enemies. But she was Apache, daughter of a people who had never yielded to any enemy, and she would not yield now. As the war party rode toward Dragoon Pass, every warrior knew they were heading toward something unprecedented. This would not be just another raid or skirmish, but a battle that would determine whether the Apache way of life would survive or perish. The weight of that knowledge sat heavily on every man's shoulders, but it also filled them with a determination that burned like sacred fire. Nalnish rode at the head of the column, his face painted for war, his weapons blessed by his wife's power. Behind him came the greatest warriors of 3 tribes, men who had chosen to follow him, not just to battle but possibly to death itself. Their war chants echoed from the canyon walls, ancient songs that called upon the spirits of their ancestors to ride beside them into battle. But it was Desba who drew the most attention as they approached their destination. She rode wrapped in a cloak made from the hide of a white buffalo, painted with symbols that seemed to move and shift in the changing light. Her hair flowed loose around her shoulders, decorated with feathers and bones that clicked softly with each step of her horse. Most remarkably, the very air around her seemed to shimmer with power, as if reality itself was bending to accommodate her presence. Animals began following them as they neared Dragoon Pass, not just the usual camp dogs and horses, but wild creatures that should have fled from the approach of so many humans. Wolves trotted alongside the war ponies, eagles circled overhead, even the rattlesnakes that denned in the rocks seemed to gather in their path. It was as if the desert itself was marshaling its forces for what was to come. When they reached the entrance to the pass, Nalnish called a halt. Ahead lay the narrow defile where Whitman's trap waited. 800 soldiers hidden among rocks that had witnessed countless battles between Apache and their enemies. The colonel's scouts had reported their approach, and even now the trap was being sprung, soldiers moving into position for the slaughter they believed was about to begin. "Hush," Desba said, using the Apache word for warrior as she addressed her husband. "Are you ready to see what the spirits can do when they choose to walk among men?" Nalnish looked at his wife, seeing not just the woman he had married, but the embodiment of powers older than human memory. "I am ready, Shikis," he replied. "Show them what it means to make war against the Apache nation." What happened next would be remembered as the day the desert itself rose up in fury against those who would destroy its children. As Desba raised her hands to the sky and began the ancient chant that would summon forces beyond human understanding, the very stones of Dragoon Pass began to tremble with anticipation. The transformation began with the wind. What started as the normal desert breeze that swept through Dragoon Pass suddenly intensified, carrying with it the scent of ozone and something else, something that made the horses of both armies stamp nervously and roll their eyes white with primal fear. Colonel Whitman, crouched behind a boulder with his field glasses trained on the Apache war party, felt the hair on his arms stand up as if lightning were about to strike. Desba stood at the mouth of the pass, her white buffalo cloak whipping around her like living flame. The symbols painted on her body began to glow with their own inner light, and the bone ornaments in her hair chimed with sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She raised her arms to the sky and spoke words in the ancient tongue, words that had been old when the pyramids were young. Yat Edian Dine, Hazon Nasha, Ta Wajitigo, Bieko Tego Dine Bikea Bihazene. The prayer called upon the holy people, the supernatural beings who had shaped the world in the time before time. She asked them to remember their children, to defend the land that had been sacred since the first dawn, to show the white soldiers what happened to those who made war upon the blessed earth itself. The response was immediate and terrifying. The ground beneath the hidden soldiers' feet began to tremble, not with the rhythmic shaking of an earthquake, but with something organic, alive, angry. Rocks that had stood unmoved for centuries suddenly shifted and groaned. The carefully concealed artillery positions that Colonel Whitman had spent days preparing began to crumble as the earth itself rejected their presence. Lieutenant Samuel Morrison, brother to the merchant from Bitter Springs, watched in horror as the boulder he was hiding behind began to split down the middle with a sound like thunder. Through the growing crack, he could see something that defied explanation, veins of light pulsing like arteries, as if the mountain itself had a heart that beat with supernatural life. "What in God's name ... Morrison whispered, but his words were cut off as the boulder exploded outward, sending fragments of stone flying like cannonballs. The lieutenant threw himself flat as razor-sharp shards whistled over his head. embedding themselves in trees 50 yards away. All along the pass, similar phenomena were occurring. The Gatling gun positions that Whitman had so carefully concealed were being revealed as the rocks around them cracked and crumbled. The mountain howitzers that should have rained death on the Apache war party were tilting at crazy angles as their foundations shifted beneath them. Worst of all, the narrow trails that were supposed to allow the soldiers to flank the Apache were sealing themselves, stone flowing like water to block every possible avenue of attack. Colonel Whitman, a man who had faced Confederate cavalry charges without flinching, found himself backing away from phenomena that challenged everything he believed about the nature of reality. "It's impossible," he muttered, even as he watched a soldier scream and point at his rifle. The metal barrel was bending like soft clay, twisting into shapes that hurt the eye to look upon. But Desba was far from finished. The wind that carried her prayers began to howl through the pass with the voice of 1,000 spirits, and within that howling could be heard the sound of drums, not physical drums beaten by human hands, but the deep, resonant heartbeat of the earth itself. The rhythm was hypnotic, compelling, and it began to affect every living thing within miles of the pass. The soldiers' horses, trained cavalry mounts that had charged through gunfire and artillery barrages, suddenly reared and bolted. No amount of pulling on the reins could control them as they fled in panic, carrying their riders away from whatever supernatural force was awakening in the desert. Within minutes, half of Whitman's mounted force was scattered across the territory, leaving the colonel with only his infantry and whatever artillery pieces hadn't been destroyed by the shifting stones. The Apache warriors, by contrast, found their horses growing stronger, faster, more sure-footed with each passing moment. The war ponies' eyes gleamed with an inner fire that matched the symbols glowing on their riders' faces. Some of the animals began to exhibit abilities that bordered on the miraculous, leaping gaps that should have been impossible, climbing rock faces as easily as level ground, moving with a speed that left afterimages burned on the retinas of anyone watching. Geronimo himself, the legendary war leader whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, rode up beside Nalnish, with wonder written across his scarred features. "In all my years of war," he said in the Apache tongue, "I have never seen the spirits answer so clearly. Your wife calls upon powers that have slept since the beginning of the world." Nalnish nodded grimly, his own weapons humming with supernatural energy as Desba's magic flowed through everything the Apache warriors carried. His war lance, inherited from his grandfather, was now wreathed in blue fire that did not burn. His bow sang with harmonic tones when he drew back the string, and his arrows left trails of light as they flew toward their targets. "She pays a price for this power," Nalnish replied, glancing back at his wife with concern that cut through his warrior's stoicism. "I can see it in her eyes. The spirits demand payment for their aid." Indeed, the transformation that Desba was undergoing was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Her skin had taken on an alabaster pallor, and dark veins were becoming visible beneath the surface, pulsing with the same rhythm as the supernatural drums. Her eyes, once the color of storm clouds, now held depths that seemed to contain entire star fields. She was becoming something more than human, and perhaps something less. But the battle was far from over. Colonel Whitman, realizing that conventional tactics were useless against an enemy that commanded supernatural forces, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. If the Apache could call upon their ancient spirits, then he would call upon something equally powerful from his own traditions. Chaplain Ezekiel Cross was not like most army chaplains. He was a man who had studied the darker corners of Christian theology, who knew that the Bible spoke not just of angels and redemption, but of demons and spiritual warfare. When Whitman explained what they were facing, Cross nodded grimly and reached for a leather satchel he had carried through a dozen campaigns. "If they want to fight with devils," the chaplain said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had wrestled with his own demons and won. Then by God will show them what righteous fury looks like. The satchel contained relics that Cross had collected during his years of service, fragments of bone from Christian martyrs, holy water blessed by bishops in Rome, pages from Bibles that had been carried through the Crusades. Most importantly, it contained a piece of the true cross itself, a splinter of wood that was said to carry the power to drive back any supernatural evil. Cross began his own ritual, speaking Latin phrases that called upon the power of Christ to defend his soldiers against the forces of darkness. He sprinkled holy water in a circle around himself and the colonel, blessed their weapons with prayers that had been old when the Roman Empire fell, and raised the fragment of the true cross toward the Apache position. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The two spiritual forces, ancient Apache magic and militant Christianity, met in the space between the armies and exploded into something that threatened to tear reality itself apart. Lightning crackled between the canyon walls without any clouds to birth it. The air shimmered with heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Most terrifyingly, the boundary between the physical world and the spirit realm began to weaken, allowing things to slip through that should never have existed in either plane. Shadow, wolves with eyes like burning coals materialized from the rocks, snarling at the Christian soldiers with voices that sounded like damned souls screaming. In response, angels of war descended from the sky, not the gentle, peaceful beings of Sunday school lessons, but terrible creatures of fire and sword whose very presence made mortals fall to their knees in terror. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Apache warriors rode alongside spirit animals that had been extinct for thousands of years, saber-toothed cats with claws that could rend steel, giant bears whose roars shattered stone, eagles with wingspans that blocked out the sun. Against them, the cavalry fought with weapons blessed by divine power, their bullets glowing with holy fire as they sought their supernatural targets. Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, a veteran of 20 years frontier service, found himself face to face with a massive spirit bear that stood 12 feet tall and radiated cold like a walking blizzard. His service revolver seemed pathetically inadequate against such a creature, but when he pulled the trigger, the bullet that emerged was wreathed in golden light. It struck the bear in the chest, and the creature exploded into a shower of ice, crystals that tinkled like wind chimes as they fell. Not far away, Private James Mackenzie watched in awe as his bayonet, blessed by Chaplain Cross's ritual, cut through the ghostly form of a shadow wolf, as easily as if it were made of flesh and bone. The creature's death howl echoed across dimensions, and its body dissolved into smoke that smelled of sulfur and regret. But for every supernatural creature that fell to blessed weapons, two more seemed to take its place. The Apache magic was drawing upon sources of power that had existed since the world was young, while the Christian ritual was limited by the faith and righteousness of those who wielded it. As the battle continued, it became clear that the soldiers' holy weapons were beginning to fail as doubt crept into their hearts. In the center of the maelstrom, Desba felt the strain of channeling so much power beginning to tear at her very essence. Blood ran from her nose and ears, and her hands shook with the effort of maintaining control over forces that wanted nothing more than to consume everything in sight. The spirits she had called upon were ancient and wild, used to roaming free across dimensions that had no names in any human language. Shikis, she gasped, reaching out to Nalnish as another wave of power flowed through her. I cannot hold them much longer. Nalnish saw the truth in her eyes. The supernatural battle was consuming her from within, burning away her humanity like fire consuming dry wood. Soon there would be nothing left but power without conscience, force without direction, and that would be as dangerous to the Apache as to their enemies. End it, he said simply, his voice cutting through the chaos of spiritual warfare. Whatever the cost, end it now. Desba nodded, understanding what he was asking. The only way to stop the supernatural battle was to make both sides withdraw their forces from the physical realm. But doing so would require her to sever her own connection to the spirit world. A connection that had become so integral to her being that cutting it might kill her. She raised her hands one final time, speaking words in the oldest tongue known to her people. The prayer was not a request but a command, ordering all supernatural forces to return to their proper realms and trouble the world of men no more. The power required to enforce such a command against beings of immense supernatural strength threatened to burn her to ash where she stood. The response was immediate. The shadow wolves, spirit bears, and other creatures of Apache magic began to fade, their forms becoming translucent before vanishing entirely. The angels of war folded their terrible wings and ascended back to whatever heaven had birthed them. Their mission ended by divine recall. In moments, the pass was clear of supernatural forces, leaving only mortal men facing each other across ground that still trembled with the echoes of otherworldly power, but the cost had been enormous. Colonel Whitman's force was reduced to less than 300 effective soldiers, their morale broken by phenomena that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. Half their weapons had been destroyed or rendered useless by exposure to supernatural forces, and their horses were scattered across miles of desert terrain. The Apache had suffered as well. Several warriors had been killed by blessed bullets or angelic swords, and others bore wounds that glowed with holy fire and refused to heal naturally. But most concerning was the state of their spiritual leader. Desba collapsed as the last of the supernatural forces departed, her body racked with convulsions as the price of her magic came due. Nalnish caught her as she fell, cradling her against his chest as she struggled to breathe. Her skin was paper white, her eyes rolled back to show only whites that pulsed with fading traces of otherworldly power. The beautiful woman he had married just days before was dying in his arms, consumed by the very forces she had wielded to save their people, the spirits. She whispered, blood frothing on her lips. They want payment, always payment. The supernatural battle of Dragoon Pass was over, but its consequences were just beginning. As Colonel Whitman rallied his surviving soldiers for a conventional attack, and Nalnish prepared to defend his dying wife, both sides realized that the war between Apache and white man had entered a new phase, one where the very foundations of reality could be weapons in the hands of those desperate enough to use them. The desert wind carried the scent of ozone and ash across the battlefield, and in that wind could be heard the whispers of spirits who had been awakened from ancient slumber. The supernatural war was ended, but the forces it had unleashed would not easily return to sleep. The territory would never be the same, and neither would the people who had witnessed the day when Earth itself went to war. The hidden valley of Shihin lay 3 days' hard ride from Dragoon Pass, accessible only through a narrow gorge that could be defended by a handful of warriors against an entire army. Ancient Apache legend claimed it was the place where Changing Woman had first taught the people the ceremonies of healing, where the boundary between the world of spirits and the world of flesh was thin as morning mist. If anywhere could save Desba's life, it would be here. Nalnish rode without stopping, his dying wife cradled in his arms as his war pony navigated treacherous mountain trails by moonlight. Behind him came a procession unlike any seen in Apache history, warriors from 3 tribes, medicine men carrying sacred bundles, women who had knowledge of healing herbs that grew nowhere else in the territory. Even their former enemies, the Comanche war chief Quanah Parker and a dozen of his best fighters, had joined the desperate journey after word spread through the Indian nations that the greatest spiritual leader in generations was dying. Desba's condition worsened with each mile. Her breathing became shallow and erratic, her skin so pale it seemed translucent. Most alarming were the strange markings that had appeared across her body, spiraling patterns that pulsed with fading light. as if the supernatural forces she had channeled were slowly consuming her from within. The Apache medicine men who examined her shook their heads gravely, speaking in whispers of ghost sickness and spirit burn, conditions that had no cure in the traditional healing arts. But in Shijin waited someone who understood such ailments better than any living person. Lozin, sister to the great chief Victorio, was more than just a warrior woman. She was Isnish, blessed with the ability to locate enemies and see into the spirit world, a power that made her invaluable in war and priceless in situations like this. She had been waiting for them, having received visions of Desba's plight 3 days before their arrival. Lozin was in her 40s, her face marked by years of warfare and the weight of supernatural responsibility. She wore her graying hair in traditional braids decorated with sacred stones, and her buckskin dress was painted with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the changing light. When she looked at Desba, her eyes reflected depths that spoke of communion with forces beyond human understanding. "The spirits have marked her," Lozin said after examining the unconscious woman. "But not for death, for transformation." "What?" "She has become as something new, something the old ceremonies cannot address." "Then she will die," Nalnish said, his voice hollow with despair. "No." Lozin's response was firm, carrying the authority of one who had never been wrong about spiritual matters. "But she cannot be saved by Apache medicine alone. The white man's god touched her during the battle, and their power flows in her blood alongside ours. She has become a bridge between worlds, and bridges require different engineering." The solution Lozin proposed was unprecedented and dangerous. They would need to combine Apache healing ceremonies with Christian rituals, blending two spiritual traditions that had been at war since the Spanish conquest. It would require the cooperation of someone from the white world who understood the deeper mysteries of their faith, someone like Chaplain Cross, whose use of holy relics had nearly killed Desba in the first place. The irony was not lost on anyone present. To save the woman who had nearly destroyed his force with Apache magic, they would need to ask for help from the military chaplain who had fought her with Christian power. It was a request that could easily be seen as treachery by both sides, a betrayal of everything the Apache had fought and died for. But love makes warriors do impossible things. "I will go," Nalnish announced, his decision cutting through the debate among the medicine men like a knife through silk. "I will go to the white soldiers and ask for their help. They will kill you on sight," Geronimo pointed out pragmatically. "You are the most wanted man in the territory. There is a bounty of $5,000 on your head." "Perhaps," Nalnish replied, his hand resting gently on Desba's fevered brow. "But she would do the same for me." The ride to the cavalries camp took 2 days, and Nalnish made it alone despite the protests of his warriors. He approached under a white flag made from strips torn from his own shirt, a gesture of truce that in Apache tradition was as binding as any treaty. But he had no way of knowing whether the white soldiers would honor such customs, or whether he was riding to his own execution. Colonel Whitman's camp was a model of military efficiency, even after the devastating losses at Dragoon Pass. The surviving soldiers had constructed earthworks and defensive positions that could withstand a siege, while scouts ranged far and wide to prevent another surprise attack. But nothing could have prepared them for the sight of the territory's most feared Apache warchief riding openly into their midst under a flag of truce. Sentries raised their rifles, officers shouted orders, and for a moment it seemed that Nalnish's desperate gamble would end in a hail of bullets. But Chaplain Cross, who had been ministering to the wounded, stepped forward with his hand raised. "Hold your fire," the chaplain commanded, his voice carrying the moral authority that came with having faced supernatural forces and survived. "Ah, man who comes under a white flag deserves to be heard, no matter who he is." Colonel Whitman emerged from his command tent, his uniform bearing the stains of recent battle and his face showing the strain of a campaign that had cost him more than half his force. He studied Nalnish with the calculating gaze of a professional soldier, noting the way the Apache warrior sat his horse, the positioning of his weapons, the alertness that marked a man ready to fight or die at a moment's notice. Nalnish, Whitman said, the name carrying weight like a physical thing. I should have you shot where you sit. You could try, the Apache replied calmly. But you need too many bullets for your other enemies. It was a statement of fact rather than a boast. Both men knew that killing Nalnish would only make him a martyr to his people, ensuring that the Apache wars would continue for another generation. More practically, the colonel needed every advantage he could get in a territory where his forces were outnumbered and outmaneuvered by enemies who knew every rock and canyon. What do you want? Whitman asked bluntly. Nalnish's response surprised everyone present. Instead of demanding terms for surrender or negotiating prisoner exchanges, he looked directly at Chaplain Cross and said, I need your help to save my wife. The request hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, impossible to ignore and equally difficult to understand. Cross stepped forward, his weathered face showing confusion and something that might have been compassion. The woman who nearly destroyed us with witchcraft? The chaplain asked. Why would we help her? Because she is dying from the same power that you used against her, Nalnish replied with devastating honesty. Your God and our spirits touched through her, and now she burns from within. She needs healing that neither your people nor mine can provide alone. Cross was silent for a long moment, his mind wrestling with theological implications that had no precedent in his training. Finally, he spoke with the voice of a man who had looked into the abyss and found faith there. What you're describing, it's not in any of my books, but I've seen what happens when divine forces clash. The spiritual battlefield leaves casualties that conventional medicine cannot treat. Will you help? Nalnish asked simply. The chaplain looked at Colonel Whitman, reading permission in the officer's reluctant nod. I'll need guarantees. Safe passage for myself and my assistants. No interference with our religious practices. And when this is over, you return to the reservation. I cannot speak for the reservation, Nalnish replied. But I give my word that no harm will come to you while you help my wife. And double quotes he paused, the words coming hard. If she dies despite your efforts, I will surrender myself to your justice. It was an offer that changed everything. Colonel Whitman's eyes widened as he realized what the Apache war chief was proposing. The end of the most destructive guerrilla campaign in territorial history, purchased with a single life. But Cross saw deeper into the warrior's motivation. You love her that much? The chaplain asked quietly. More than life, Nalnish replied without hesitation. More than freedom. More than victory itself. The journey back to Shihejin was surreal in its unlikelihood. Nalnish rode alongside Chaplain Cross and two military medics, their small party protected by Apache warriors who just days before had been trying to kill the white men. The escort was necessary not just for safety, but for the sacred bundles and religious artifacts both sides carried, Apache medicine bundles and Christian relics that would be combined in a ceremony never before attempted. They found Desba worse than when Nalnish had left. Her breathing was barely perceptible, and the glowing marks on her skin had spread to cover almost her entire body. Lozin met them at the valley's entrance, her face grave but determined. We must begin immediately, she said. The spirit paths are closing. Soon she will be too far away for any earthly power to reach. What followed was a religious ceremony that defied every theological tradition known to either culture. Apache medicine men chanted ancient prayers while Chaplain Cross read from the New Testament. Sacred pollen was mixed with holy water, eagle feathers blessed alongside crucifixes. The two spiritual traditions, which had been enemies for centuries, wove together into something entirely new. The focal point of the ceremony was Desba herself, lying on a bed of woven grasses in the center of a circle marked with both Apache sacred symbols and Christian crosses. Lozan and Cross stood on opposite sides of the circle, their voices joining in harmonies that should have been impossible. Apache healing songs blending with Latin hymns in ways that made the air itself vibrate with power. As the ceremony progressed, the markings on Desba's skin began to change. Instead of the harsh burning lines that had appeared after the supernatural battle, softer patterns emerged, designs that incorporated both the lightning symbols of Apache tradition and the radiating light of Christian iconography. Her breathing deepened and color began to return to her deathly pale features. But the true miracle came when she opened her eyes. They held depths that reflected both worlds, the ancient wisdom of her Apache heritage and the redemptive power of Christian faith. She was still herself, still Desba, but transformed into something greater, a living bridge between cultures that had been at war since Europeans first set foot in the New World. Ahehe, she whispered, the Apache word for gratitude addressed to both the medicine men and the chaplain. I understand now. The vision was not just about power, but about unity, about healing more than just bodies. In the days that followed, word of the miraculous healing spread throughout the territory. Apache warriors who had sworn never to trust. White men found themselves talking with cavalry officers about shared struggles against the harsh desert environment. Settlers who had lived in terror of Indian raids discovered that their savage neighbors had knowledge of farming and water conservation that could save lives during droughts. The transformation was not immediate or universal. There were those on both sides who preferred the certainty of hatred to the uncertainty of peace. Samuel Briggs from Bitter Springs continued to preach that all Indians were devils in human form, while several Apache war chiefs denounced Nalnish as a traitor who had sold his people's freedom for a woman's life. But something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual landscape of the Southwest. The successful blending of Apache and Christian healing traditions opened possibilities that neither culture had imagined alone. Mixed ceremonies began appearing in both white settlements and Indian camps, creating a new form of spirituality that honored both traditions while belonging exclusively to neither. Desba became the living symbol of this transformation. Her survival and change represented proof that enemies could become allies, that differences could become strengths, that love could indeed conquer the accumulated hatred of generations. She moved between both worlds now, equally welcome in Apache camps and Christian churches, carrying messages of healing and reconciliation wherever she went. The political implications were enormous. If Apache spiritual leaders and Christian chaplains could work together to save a single life, what other collaborations might be possible? Trade agreements that benefited both cultures? Shared knowledge that could help everyone survive in an unforgiving land? Perhaps even a peace that was built on mutual respect rather than enforced through superior firepower? But such possibilities would have to wait. Even as Desba recovered her strength and the two cultures began their tentative steps toward understanding, darker forces were gathering. The territorial governor, faced with the political embarrassment of his army's failure to defeat a single Apache band, was calling for reinforcements from the federal government. Within weeks, fresh troops would arrive with orders to complete the pacification of the Southwest by any means necessary. The brief window of opportunity for peace was closing, and only the love between a warrior and a healer stood between the territory and a war that would make the previous conflicts look like children's games. The healing of hearts had begun, but healing nations would require miracles that even combined spiritual traditions might not be able to provide. 6 months after the miraculous healing in Shijin, the Arizona Territory stood on the knife's edge between unprecedented peace and total annihilation. The fragile alliance between Apache and white communities had produced remarkable results: joint patrols that protected travelers from Mexican bandits, shared knowledge that had ended a devastating drought through improved irrigation techniques, and mixed trading posts where former enemies now haggled over the price of corn and ammunition with equal vigor. General Philip Blackwood was not a man interested in peace treaties or cultural exchanges. The federal government's newly appointed territorial commander had arrived from Washington with 5,000 fresh troops, modern artillery, and explicit orders to solve the Apache problem once and for all. His solution was as simple as it was final: complete removal of all native populations to reservations in Oklahoma, with deadly force authorized against anyone who resisted. Blackwood was everything that Colonel Whitman was not: a political general who had earned his rank through connections rather than battlefield prowess, a man who saw the Indian Wars as an opportunity for career advancement rather than a complex human tragedy. He had built his reputation on the brutal pacification of tribes in Kansas and Nebraska, using tactics that shocked even hardened frontier soldiers. The general's first act upon arriving at Fort McDowell was to declare the informal peace agreements null and void, and issue an ultimatum that reverberated through every settlement and camp in the territory. All Apache would report to designated collection points within 30 days for transport to Oklahoma. Any found outside these areas after the deadline would be considered hostile and shot on sight. The ultimatum created panic among both Apache and white communities that had learned to coexist. Martha Henderson, whose children had been healed by Desba's medicine, organized a petition signed by 300 settlers asking the government to reconsider. Trading Post Pete, a grizzled frontier merchant who had made a fortune selling goods to both cultures, found himself facing the loss of his entire livelihood. Even many of the cavalry officers who had fought the Apache for years spoke privately of the injustice of punishing people who had chosen peace. But General Blackwood was unmoved by appeals to mercy or practical concerns. He had come to Arizona to establish his credentials as the man who finally ended the Indian Wars, and no amount of local sentiment would deter him from that goal. His adjutant, Major Robert Creed, was cut from the same cloth, a career officer who saw Native Americans as obstacles to American expansion rather than human beings deserving of consideration. The crisis came to a head when Daniel Clearwater, a mixed-blood Apache who had served as translator during the peace negotiations, was arrested while visiting his white wife in the settlement of Willow Creek, under Blackwood's new orders. Clearwater's Apache heritage made him subject to immediate deportation. Regardless of his marriage or his service to the territorial government, news of the arrest reached Nalnish and Desba at their home in a secluded canyon where they had been working to establish a school that would teach Apache children English while preserving their traditional knowledge. Desba's transformation during her healing had given her abilities that transcended simple medicine. She could see into human hearts, understand the deepest motivations that drove people's actions, and speak with a moral authority that cut through political rhetoric like a blade through silk. "This Blackwood seeks not peace but glory," she told her husband as they watched the sun set over the desert they both loved. "He will use Daniel's arrest to provoke us into attacking. Then he will point to our response as justification for his war." Nalnish's scarred face was grim as he considered their options. The Apache could fade into the deep desert, continuing their traditional life of raiding and hiding until the white soldiers tired of chasing shadows. But that would mean abandoning the peace they had fought so hard to build, returning to a cycle of violence that would eventually consume his people entirely. "There is another way," Desba continued, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "But it will require us to trust in something greater than weapons or warriors." What she proposed was audacious beyond reason, a direct appeal to the American people themselves, bypassing the military and political authorities who had already decided the Apache fate. Using contacts established during the peace negotiations, they would arrange for a public demonstration of the cooperation that had been achieved between the cultures, showing the nation that there was an alternative to extermination. The plan required allies from both worlds. Colonel Whitman, despite orders to support Blackwood's policies, quietly provided intelligence about troop movements and federal intentions. Chaplain Cross used his connections with Eastern churches to arrange publicity for their cause. Most crucially, Judge Theodore Morrison, Samuel's uncle and a territorial jurist known for his fairness, agreed to preside over a public hearing that would examine the legality of Blackwood's orders. The hearing was scheduled to take place in Tucson, the territorial capital, with representatives from major newspapers invited to witness and record the proceedings. It would be the first time in American history that Apache leaders would be permitted to speak publicly in their own defense, presenting their case directly to the white population rather than through military intermediaries. But General Blackwood had no intention of allowing such a hearing to take place. 3 days before the scheduled proceedings, he ordered the arrest of all Apache leaders within 100 miles of Tucson, claiming intelligence of a planned uprising. Federal marshals and cavalry units began sweeping through the territory, rounding up anyone with native blood, regardless of their legal status or political loyalties. The manhunt for Nalnish became the largest military operation in territorial history. 5 columns of soldiers moved through the desert like the fingers of a closing fist, supported by Pima scouts who knew the terrain and Navajo trackers who could follow a trail through solid rock. General Blackwood himself took field command, determined to personally capture the man who had embarrassed the army at Dragoon Pass. For 3 weeks, the chase continued across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Nalnish and Desba, accompanied by a handful of loyal warriors, led their pursuers through landscapes that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to venture there. They crossed salt flats where the alkali dust burned men's lungs, climbed mountains where snow fell in June, and traversed canyons where the temperature could exceed 120 degrees in the shade. But this was not merely a game of pursuit and evasion. Desba's transformed abilities allowed her to do more than simply evade capture. She could reach into the hearts and minds of their pursuers, showing them visions of what their actions really meant. Cavalry soldiers began to see the faces of Apache children who would die of disease in Oklahoma camps. Officers found themselves questioning orders that violated everything they had sworn to protect as soldiers of the Republic. The psychological warfare was devastating to military morale. Captain William Hayes led his company into an ambush that should have been a massacre, only to find himself face to face with Desba herself. Instead of attacking, she spoke to him about his own children back in Ohio, reminding him that Apache parents loved their children just as fiercely as white parents loved theirs. Hayes ordered his men to stand down, and when pressed by his superiors, claimed that tactical considerations made an attack inadvisable. Similar incidents occurred throughout the campaign. Soldiers reported equipment failures that prevented them from pursuing fleeing Apache. Scouts claimed to lose tracks that were clearly visible to everyone else. Most disturbing to General Blackwood, several of his officers began requesting transfers rather than continue the hunt for people they no longer saw as enemies. The breaking point came when the pursuit led into the sacred canyon where Nalnish and Desba had been married. The general, driven by frustration and political pressure from Washington, ordered his artillery to shell the ancient rock formations where petroglyphs recorded thousands of years of Apache history. The bombardment was intended to flush out the hiding fugitives, but its effect was to destroy irreplaceable cultural treasures that could never be replaced. The destruction of the sacred sites was captured by William Harrison, a photographer working for Harper's Weekly, whose images of shattered rock art and desecrated burial grounds were transmitted by telegraph to newspapers across the nation. The photographs sparked outrage that transcended political party lines, with religious leaders, artists, and ordinary citizens expressing horror at the deliberate destruction of ancient American heritage. Public opinion, which had largely supported Indian removal as a necessary evil, began to shift as people saw the human cost of Blackwood's policies. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, called for congressional hearings into military conduct in the territories. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow published a poem titled "The Last Apache" that was reprinted in dozens of newspapers. Most importantly, President Rutherford Hayes himself began to question whether the Army's methods were consistent with American values. But the real transformation came when Desba made a decision that would be remembered for generations. Instead of continuing to run, she and Naunish walked into Tucson under a white flag, surrendering themselves to federal authorities while demanding the public hearing that had been promised. Their arrival created a sensation that drew crowds from across the territory, people coming to see the legendary Apache war chief and the woman who had nearly died for her people's freedom. The hearing that followed was unlike any legal proceeding in American history. Judge Morrison presided with fairness that impressed even Blackwood's supporters, while reporters from major Eastern newspapers recorded every word for a national audience hungry for the truth about the Indian Wars. But the real drama came when Desba was permitted to speak in her own defense. She spoke for 3 hours, her words translated by Daniel Clearwater, who had been released pending the hearing's outcome, and recorded by stenographers whose shorthand could barely keep pace with her eloquence. She told the story of her people from their own perspective, not as savages resisting civilization, but as human beings fighting to preserve their children's future in the land their ancestors had called home for countless generations. More than her words, it was her presence that transformed the proceedings. The spiritual power that had nearly consumed her at Dragoon Pass now flowed through her speech, allowing everyone present to see through Apache eyes, to understand what it meant to watch your culture being systematically destroyed in the name of progress. Hardened frontier settlers wept openly as she described the deaths of children who had never seen their homeland. Career soldiers questioned everything they thought they knew about their duty to their country. When she finished speaking, the courtroom was silent for a full minute. Then Judge Morrison delivered a ruling that would reshape territorial law, declaring that the Apache had been unlawfully denied due process, that their forced removal violated both territorial statutes and federal constitutional guarantees, and that General Blackwood's orders exceeded his lawful authority. The legal victory was only the beginning. Public pressure generated by the hearing forced President Hayes to recall General Blackwood and institute a new policy toward Native Americans in the Southwest. Instead of forced removal, the territorial government would negotiate permanent reservations within Arizona, recognizing Apache land rights while establishing frameworks for peaceful coexistence. Naunish and Desba became the public faces of this new policy, traveling to Washington to meet with federal officials and address Congress about the possibilities for peace between cultures. Their love story, which had begun with a rescue from execution, became a symbol of hope for a nation struggling to heal the wounds of decades of racial conflict. The Apache reservation established in the Dragoon Mountains encompassed a sacred canyon where they had been married, ensuring that their children would grow up knowing the songs and stories of their ancestors. But it was not a prison. Apache were free to come and go, to work in white settlements, or establish businesses that served both communities. 5 years later, Desba stood in the school they had built together, watching Apache children learn to read English while their grandparents taught them the traditional ways of finding water in the desert. Her own children, twins named for the storm clouds and lightning that had brought their parents together, played with Mexican, Anglo, and Indian children whose parents had once been mortal enemies. The transformation was not complete or universal. There were still those on all sides who preferred the certainty of hatred to the uncertainty of peace. Ranchers who resented Apache hunting rights, warriors who mourned the old days of raiding and warfare, politicians who found conflict more profitable than cooperation. But something fundamental had changed in the Arizona territory. The woman who had been sentenced to burn as a witch had become the bridge between worlds, proving that love could indeed triumph over fear. That understanding could overcome generations of mistrust, that two peoples who seemed destined for eternal conflict could choose a different path. As the sun set over the desert they both loved, Nalnish took his wife's hand and listened to their children's laughter echoing from the canyon walls. They had saved more than just their own lives. They had saved the possibility of a future where differences became strengths rather than sources of conflict. The legend would grow in the telling, passed down through generations of children who grew up in a world where Apache and Anglo, Mexican and Indian, could call each other neighbors without reaching for weapons. They would speak of the woman who was sentenced to burn at sunrise until the territory's deadliest Apache claimed her as his wife, and in doing so, claimed a future of peace for all their children.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.